Human soldiers were buzzing around like the guards of a kicked hornet's nest, after a wave of dark realization had slowly but surely been spreading through their ranks. The tremors gradually reaching alarm bell after alarm bell, eventually leading to a concerto of ringing, while enormous red flags began to wave. Although there was no clear picture yet of what exactly it was, a deep certainty had quickly taken hold that something, anything, was most certainly wrong here. And even though nobody could tell with certainty exactly what was wrong, or just how wrong it really was, nobody was willing to find out the hard way anymore. Not after everything that happened. "And you are sure you were the first?" Admiral Krieger loudly asked into her radio, her voice loud enough to border on yelling as she posed her authoritative question. James glanced over at his mother as she waited for the reply from her soldiers, only for a moment to take in her expression to try and gauge how bad things really were. The Admiral usually kept a pretty cool head, whenever she wasn't fighting with him specifically at least, so hearing her raise her voice indicated that she felt a sense of danger that may be greater than the vague situation directly called for. "Yes, ma'am," the voice of a young man came out of the radio speakers a moment later. "We had the task to run the first assessment just like the system says. However, we didn't run into any group of cyborgs, nor did we tell anyone to stand closer to the main building to look better for any cameras." The Admiral's scowl deepened as her eyes narrowed at her radio for a moment. "Understood," she finally stated into the device. "Stay alert. There may be imposters running about. Do not trust anyone who cannot unquestionably identify themselves." "Understood, ma'am," the voice replied briefly, before the Admiral sighed and allowed the radio to sink down. Her lips then released a mild, clacking sound, as she just opened their very corners into an aggressive grimace. "I'm starting to get really tired of these smoke and mirror parlor tricks," she said, with a mostly calm voice that carried just a hint of the absolute malice underneath. "Nothing should have been able to get in or out of this station without us knowing. How in all 9 rings do some upstart terrorists sneak themselves through?" James lifted his hand to his mouth as he thought about that. Finally, he released a long breath through his nose. Maybe they didn't have to, he mumbled, as the only idea that made any sense to him. The Admiral lifted an eyebrow at him, wordlessly asking him to elaborate. James wasn't sure if she didn't have the thought herself yet, or if she simply wanted him to talk her through it to try and confirm any possible theories she may have had. Either way, he decided not to argue too much as he explained, "Well, since the decision to grant me the council seat that brought us here in the first place had to be discussed and decided on by the council first, that means there are a good few people who knew that we would likely be coming here long before we did. Long shot, maybe they didn't need to smuggle themselves in because they were here before we were?" The Admiral nodded, her own hand now also wandering to her mouth now as she thought. "If that's the case, it makes you wonder what they were waiting for," Sheeta chimed in from James's side. Even as she spoke, her ears were constantly twitching around nervously, eager to pick up on any unusual sound that may happen in their surroundings, while her tail swayed with aggressive tension. On his other side, Admir had his arms crossed, balancing on one leg while the tip of his left foot rhythmically tapped against the station's floor. His gaze had been lowered for a while now as he was lost in deep thought, though as he heard Sheeta's question, it snapped up for a moment as the man looked around over the thousands of people that were still surrounding them on all sides, seeming none the wiser to the change in atmosphere that the humans were going through. Maybe for the opportunity to do the biggest possible damage, he supposed, seeming to talk more to himself than to actually answer Sheeta directly. His gaze kept wandering for a few moments more before he loosened one of his arms from their tangle to run it along the side of his head. But how? Seeming to catch the tail end of his quiet murmuring as she returned from setting some of the surrounding soldiers into motion, Coco looked up along the walls of the enormous council building that stood majestically in front of them. "At least we know it can't be anything in there," she said, her voice hinting vaguely at a bit of relief. Sheeta was glad that someone could still see the positives in the situation, even if eliminating one angle of possible catastrophe really was a small consolation prize in the grand scheme of things. A hint of doubt still nagged at the back of his mind, telling him that maybe they had missed something there as well. However, he had to fight those down. They had done everything shy of taking that entire building apart and putting it back together after. They couldn't focus their energy on searching for the problem in the one place where they knew it couldn't be. Suddenly, Admir snapped up, his pondering seemingly stuck through by a single thought that he needed to get out right now. "Admiral, please order everyone to remove their breath filters," he requested hastily, though he still tried his best to remain professional. Admiral Krieger's head tilted slightly at the request, but only for a second before she nodded. "Good idea," she confirmed, before lifting her radio once again, briefly changing some of its settings before she loudly spoke into it. "This is Admiral Krieger to all teams. Remove your breath filters immediately." Once she had given the order and a rain of confirmations was coming in, everyone at present already got to work fulfilling it as well, releasing seals with quiet hisses, before pulling their heads free from the masks and shaking their hair out. "Well, if we're lucky they aren't pitched into our comms right now and blunted their way right into our arms," Andrej commented, as he briefly ran a hand through his long hair to untangle it. He didn't sound all too hopeful about that actually happening, though. "And even if they are, some of our people have a better chance to spot someone who's out of place," Coco confirmed, though a moment later she scratched her cheek and began to look slightly sheepish. "Though, let's hope we don't get a bunch of false alarms from people who simply haven't run into each other yet." The Admiral shook her head in response. "I trust that all of my soldiers have the basic ability to know how to have someone identify themselves," she stated dryly, before she started to look along the rows of soldiers that were lining the various assembled crowds on nearly all sides of them. Even for her, there was obviously no way to know every single person currently under her command, so it was unlikely that she could tell if someone was out of place just at a glance. Still, James knew she was looking for other things on their faces than familiarity. Nervousness, aggression, even overbearing calmness. Everything could be a hint towards someone feeling like they were about to be found out. However, James didn't expect her to find anything quite so easily. With a hint of dread steadily building in his stomach that something would slip through the cracks despite all care, he briefly glanced back at the group of cyborgs, who seemed to have been deliberately directed into their current position by someone whose intentions were unknown, but more likely than not malicious towards them, at the very least as an extension of the malice that said unknown felt towards him. However, unlike him, these people were just, well, people. Normal people, living normal lives. They had come here to see Curie, who had been trying so hard to be like them once, before... James swallowed heavily and glanced over at Nia, who was quietly talking to Tuya, Nicola and Simon, not far away from him. A pang of guilt shot through him as he looked at her. "We should get the people out of here, shouldn't we?" he finally said, turning his gaze towards his mother a moment later. "Whatever is happening here is too dangerous to just let it unfold." The Admiral slowly exhaled through her nose, her eyes still assessing everything around them. "Oh, that is what they want us to do," she mumbled, though it sounded like she was just posing that as an option instead of being in any way sure of it. She then sighed and shook her head once again. "If we do that, we are going to have to make sure it is done in a slow and controlled manner. We can't have this turn into chaos. What's imperative is that we keep a tight lock on this situation and do not lose our ability to oversee it all. We can't give them an opening to slip through in our very attempt to not let them slip through." James's jaws clenched briefly as an annoyingly familiar part of him instantly wanted to snap and argue with her, even if he didn't truthfully think what she said was all that wrong in the end. It was just an irritating leftover from their even more hostile days towards each other. "Not to overstep here, but I may have an idea, ma'am." Andrej suddenly chimed in, and walked up to the Admiral, whose sharp hazel eyes quickly locked with his crimson ones. "I'm all ears, Major," she replied, without a moment of hesitation, speaking of honest candidness towards hearing his plan out. The man lifted a hand to hook a finger into the collar of his jacket and shirt, running it along the inside to pull the fabric away from sticking to his skin. It certainly was warm around here, but that wasn't exactly what had him sweating. He swallowed heavily, as his eye subtly darted over to the large door opening in the distance. Although they were just splotches of colour from this distance, his mind could fill in the gaps about what was happening over there. Meanwhile, A reporter standing nearby, whose crew hadn't quite managed to get themselves any of the real good spots for the day, among all this onrush, spoke into a camera with a put-on, "This is important" voice. It looks like the cyborg known as Curie is now stepping out of the council building again after their hearing with the council concluded for today, the Sippersling dutifully reported, while the camera swung around to zoom in on the black shape of that creature, as it crawled out of the much too large for its size gateway, and joined back up with the bulk of the people who had accompanied it on its way there. The bulk of them being the crucial term. By the look of things, they are being welcomed by the human admiral. The candidates Alwyn, Ajaxia, and Strentane, who seem to have originally planned to wait for the cyborg's return themselves, have not yet returned after they were quite suddenly escorted from the premises by their human security about a quarter of an hour ago. So far, the human military has made no statements about why the candidates were so swiftly escorted off the scene, but one can only assume that there has to be some form of perceived threat to these politically vital people to cause such a reaction. Though so far there has been no statements made concerning public safety, indicating that whatever the threat may be, it is most likely deemed to be specific to the candidates themselves. The man tugged on his collar one last time, before allowing it to snap back against his neck with a smack of his lips. He had front row seats when the saint was dragged away, under the very careful gazes of all those officers earlier. By now, he was most likely sitting pretty in a nice, cozy cabin, untouchable up on one of the warships. They had really gotten careful around him, that much was clear. Got him the fuck out of Dodge first and foremost, while leaving plenty of his little friends behind to handle the publicity while he sat it out. The man clicked his tongue a couple of times, as he looked over at the unfolding reunion again. Seemed like they were taking their sweet time. A moment later, he glanced up at the giant meat carpet who lumbered right behind him. The Oxygeritarian, who didn't have to bother with such a damn uncomfortable uniform, as she obviously needed nothing but one of the local security identifiers as her disguise, nodded her head slowly, causing the many meat flaps that grew out of her mottled skin to wiggle disturbingly. It was just about time. Both of them soon enough lifted their respective forms of communication, pretending to listen to something for a couple of moments, before loudly confirming their orders in a professional tone, and beginning to pull back out of the crowd. With just how many people had come to this place, it of course took them a bit to truly work themselves all the way through, during which the man constantly had to dodge arms, hands, tails, and other stuff, hanging right at the height of his face, while he weaved through the masses of mostly giants. Hundreds of people later, they finally emerged on the crowd's other side, now fairly close to the station's walls. Still, even back here they weren't quite out of the woods yet. The UHSDF really had smelled blood in the water, it seemed. More soldiers, legitimate ones, were still keeping an overwatch of the situation this far away from their main ward. They would have to move carefully if they didn't want to blow their cover this close to the finish line. Luckily, the basic training he had endured under the whip of his insane father had given him more than enough knowledge to help him not stick out. He knew how to follow their orders and how to behave while doing it. Never in his life would he have expected to be glad about that at some point. But the Lord worked in mysterious ways, and now it was clear that there had always been a plan for his suffering. Oh, how he wished that he had been allowed to bring his pendant. Of course he understood why it would have been detrimental. But still, a moment like this would have been one like no other to thank and praise the Lord for showing him that he had walked on the right path. But no, he shouldn't dwell. It wasn't the symbol that gave them the connection, and even without it he knew that he was walking closer to heaven than he ever did before. With that knowledge in his heart, he moved with purpose, keeping up a stiff and directed stride, as he walked right past the soldiers without dignifying their presence with a glance. He acted like he belonged. That was crucial here. They all had their own orders and their own things to do. None of them had the time to constantly stop each other for questioning. Still, if they smelled as much as a whiff of uncertainty, they wouldn't hesitate. And that's why he couldn't show them any. The streets around them, the roofs above their heads, yes, even the ground under their feet, They were all crawling with the misled, those on the wrong path. The poor fools who were stumbling their way through the rocky roads of life as they followed the blinding light of a radiant saint like moths to the flame. He pitied them. It was so easy to see why they went wrong. With so much bad happening all around, the urge to be saved could be overwhelming. However, be it man, angel, or even the Lord made flesh himself, no salvation could come from anything within his creation. If even he failed through the flaws brought through his descent into form, then all saviors were doomed to suffer the same fate from the very start, and lead all those who were following straight down into the abyss with them. "Is this one?" he announced loudly, playing his role out perfectly even while ruminating on his own thoughts. He had already pulled his phone out, pretending to briefly check a map before confirming the building they were standing next to as their destination, just loud enough for close-by soldiers to possibly overhear if they were trying to. The building itself was a small store for antiques that stood quaintly away from the beaten path, and had the strong appearance of something that wasn't run as a way to make profit, but instead simply fulfilled some kind of long-kept desire for its owner, which in turn made it stand out quite firmly from all the rather uniform and plain metal walls of the other buildings that surrounded it on all sides. The outer walls were painted in a golden brown colour, and instead of lettering that was attached to the walls in some way, a quaint little sign standing in front of the door informed about the location's name. Inherit Venevu's collection of antiquities. The inside of the store was much the same, filled with rows and rows of wooden shelves that were filled with all manner of old trinkets, hailing from various planets. From behind the counter at the far end of the store, a slightly elderly Pepfulasis looked over at the new arrivals with a slightly cross-eyed gaze. The crescent-shaped ears on his head spread ever so slightly apart as he processed who had come in there. "Excuse me, sir." The uniformed human quickly greeted the alien, standing straight in a respectful manner as he looked up at the large creature. "We believe this location may offer a valuable vantage point to oversee the ongoing event for possible threats. Would it be possible to get your permission to use the upper level for a brief time?" The Pepfasis released a slightly hoarse, pondering sound, while the almost gill-like nostrils on his face flared a bit. "Why, of course," he then quickly confirmed with a slow nod. His croaky voice sounded just as up in age as the rest of him looked. "Right this way." He reached out a slightly shaky arm to gesture towards the nearby frame of a door, though there was no actual door in it, that led to an oversized stairway right behind it. "I hope it's not too much of a bother," the old Xeno then almost lamented, as he walked up the entryway to meet with the two soldiers. "This building is not outfitted for the smaller species." "I'll manage." The human quickly waved the concern off, even though he was surprised that the old man sounded honestly guilty about the circumstances. What an odd fella. With a gesture, the human indicated for his accomplice to go on ahead, and watched as the enormous salamander dragged her disturbing body up the large stairs with her 8 webbed hand feet. It really was quite the sight seeing her almost glide up the steps, especially because her flesh fur hung all the more disturbingly off her body as she did. Then, he took a deep breath, briefly steeling himself for the task ahead. It really was a good thing he had kept himself in shape. Thanks to the low gravity, it actually wasn't all that hard to drag himself up the large stairs, each of which reached just above his knee in height. But it was still annoying. If everything was going well, which he would have to rely on since there was no room for going back or second-guessing anymore, it should be right about now that the UHSDF's chain of command would get the convincing call-in that a team of theirs was actually taking position in this very building. Just in time for him to poke his mug through one of the upper windows, showing that there really was someone wearing the right uniform chilling up here as announced. Since it would be expected for someone to be here, he showed himself completely open. The only thing he had to do now was not to behave in a suspicious way, so that no one would have a reason to question him being here. Therefore, as long as he looked like he was surveying the situation, things should be absolutely fine. And he would look just like that while he proceeded with his actual task. In all honesty, he had no idea just how exactly the guide had found this exact spot. At least if it really was as perfect as he claimed it was. According to whatever intel they had, this spot, and this spot only, allowed for the view onto a very special part of the council building ceiling that was near completely obscure from basically all other angles, be they above or below. The odds of something like that happening, even in such a huge place, was so incredibly slim that the man had to wonder if it was somehow installed into the station purposefully, even if he couldn't quite imagine what exact purpose it may have been built for. Well, maybe it had no purpose at all. Maybe it just exited for a cosmic coin flip, and by some incredible coincidence, the guide had actually managed to find it among the many thousand places on this station. Or maybe the Lord worked in mysterious ways. In order to not make himself suspicious, he didn't look left or right as he gazed out of the window. Instead, he immediately used a pair of binoculars to gaze straight ahead over the crowd. Only for a very brief moment did his gaze briefly scrape over the hidden sister, crouching in the secret spot, almost completely hidden in between the large exhaust of one of the internal air conditioning units and the two adjacent pipes of its cooling systems. Her dedication was nothing but absolutely admirable, as she had been waiting up there with nothing but her mission and some very meager supplies for days on end, not once even making the hint of a complaint, while events unraveled around her, leaving her with nothing to do but agonizingly wait for her moment. He couldn't even imagine the kind of state she must have been in right now, and yet she remained patient. Like a snake in the grass, she bid her time, waiting for the exact fraction of a second to strike. Even after all this waiting, she wouldn't have more time than that. She wouldn't even be able to poke her head out of her nigh-perfect hiding spot, not for a second, without the risk of being spotted by the vigilant eyes of any of the surrounding soldiers. That's what he was here for. He would have to be her eyes. For the first time since they had arrived, he activated the microphone of the device in his collar, which he had kept deadened, so far, so that there was no chance of it possibly endangering the dedicated sister's mission. "Sister Moreau, I am in position," he announced. Even just looking above his binoculars with his bare eyes for a moment, he could see that the sister barely moved in her position, even as she heard what may have been the first voice speaking to her in days. "Brava Esposito," she replied, her voice calm and deep as a gentle sea. "I am ready. Just point me to them." Esposito exhaled slowly. "Your moment is almost at hand," he assured her, as he looked down for his binoculars again, taking in the scene in front of the building she was waiting upon. "Just be patient a little longer." As it was planned, the cyborg's emergence from the council building had summoned a herd of reporters and journalists to stall it and its group from leaving the premises. Quite lucky. It seemed that it was going to work on the first try. "I would wait for months more if it would let us topple the idol of the saint," Sister Moreau replied, with that same almost meditative calmness. The possibility had been discussed that they might have to drag this plan out for much longer than they already had. However, once again, the Lord was on their side. Esposito counted the paces from one Xeno to another, mapping the distance out in his head. "They are standing close enough," he then announced, realizing that the metal monster, as well as many of its friends, were standing almost perfectly for everything to unfold. If she only brought the weapon down right in front of her, it would be able to unfold its devastating effect and strike true. "All you need to..." His sentence was interrupted by a sharp intake of breath from his Xeno accomplice, who had so far quietly waited behind him to watch over things unfolding. Almost within the very same moment that she had sucked in the breath, a high piercing noise suddenly cut through the room, immediately followed by the feeling of something warm and wet hitting the side of Esposito's head and neck. His eyes widened as his brain was left with fractions of a second to process what had happened, as he only heard the sound of something heavy hitting the ground behind him. Time slowed down as his mind rapidly flashed through the options he had, everything going by like a sped-up picture show in front of his inner eye. "No, quickly!" he managed to yell out, while he tried to shoot around, reaching for the weapon on his hip. although he didn't even get to turn his head a quarter of the way before a force hit him so violently in the left side of his back that his already lifeless body was torn out of the window, flipping over 2 times on its way down, as it simply ragdolled to the floor. With Esposito's voice suddenly cutting off, and the sound of screams erupting faintly in the distance, Moreau knew that there was no time. She had to do it right now. Determined that all her patience cannot have been in vain, she burst out of her hiding spot while clutching the weapons between her hands. Things had fallen into place. All she needed to do was to throw it. All she needed... In a splash, her body was thrown back against the pipe she had just been hiding behind. Her inside sprained across the metal out of 2 large holes, almost a second before the sound of the gunshots rang out across the ceiling. Slipping from her grasp as her arm went limp, the weapon clattered to the ground, uselessly, rolling a few measures away from her before coming to a standstill. The life behind her eyes had already left, as they emptily stared off in the direction of her killer, still wide in disbelief at just how this all could have happened within less than a few seconds. On the other end of her corpse's vacant stare, the shoulders of a black-haired man slowly sank as he released a long breath, while gradually allowing the scope of his gun to sink as well. "Nice shot, Baz," Athena said, as she suddenly put her gun down as well, whipping her head around slightly so her ponytail would gently slap against James's shoulder. "Looks like you're not so rusty after all." James fully settled his weapon around hip height before reaching up and wiping some sweat from his forehead. "Thanks, but I don't think this is over," he replied, as he briefly looked down at the people turned spray paint that were lying lifeless at their feet. Sadly, this had absolutely not been the time to attempt for a disarming shot, instead of going for the surefire kill. "That did feel like a symptom much more than a cause," Admic confirmed through their shared communications, though James could also hear his voice echoing up from outside the window he was standing in front of, as the lieutenant was positioned right under it, having literally waited right under the would-be assassin's nose. "At least there would have been a very clumsy attempt if it was their only one," Tuya commented, and their peaceful discussion was only slightly disturbed by the screams still happening after a dead body had suddenly dropped out of a building, followed by several very loud gunshots. Hopefully the soldiers would be able to keep the panicking crowd somewhat under control. Sadly, the shots had been necessary. "All the more reason to keep moving," Andrich announced, his voice also coming faintly through Tuya's line, since the two of them were standing rather close as they guarded their backs in the store below. "Cleanup's on the way. Form up on me, and we'll see if we can't find some pests scattering in the aftermath." "Yes, sir," James and Athena simultaneously replied, before quickly slinging their larger weapons around their shoulders and hurrying back to the stairs. Sheeta's expression darkened as her ears twitched heavily after the shots had rung out. Quickly she grabbed onto Nia's shoulders, pulling her a little closer as the surrounding crowd began to squirm in nervous movement, even while the surrounding soldiers did their very best to assure them that everything was under control. "Jamie and Sam for sure," Coco said in a very knowing tone, standing about a step away from her, as she too kept a close eye on the nervous crowd. Sheeta couldn't help but bite her lip a bit, annoyed that she had to stay behind, while the team decided to go on the offensive for once, figuring that, after all the care they had put into his protection so far, none of their foes would expect for James of all people to actively go on the hunt. Of course, she also knew that she basically had no one to blame but herself, but that didn't exactly make it sting any less. However, the least she could do now was try and make sure everyone else would be alright while those 5 were out there cleaning house. And so, she kept a close eye on all the civilians. Finn would probably be fine as long as he stayed close to his sister, and she wasn't all that worried about Curie, considering everything she had known the cyborg to survive. Conglorch also could watch out for himself, so that left only Nia and the 2 influencers to keep out of harm's way. So far, no full-on panic was breaking out, but Sheeta could tell people were right on the verge. Now would really be the time to go, wouldn't it? She heavily suggested towards the commander standing close to her. Although there was technically someone way further up the ladder nearby, Coco was the one currently in charge of the protective measures, and could therefore make that call. Sheeta highly doubted that the Admiral would object if they all wanted to get out of there. Yeah, fair, Coco agreed, barely a second after Sheeta had said it, her green eyes making direct contact with Sheeta's. Let's go. Simon had lowered his camera by now, quickly moving to support Nia's other side to help her walk, while Nicola took it upon herself to swiftly rush over to get Curie and Konglorch on board. In the meantime, Sheeta's awareness still hovered all around them, making sure nothing would be able to sneak up on them, as they started to make their way back down the protected corridor leading through the sea of people that lay behind them. Though, she was stopped in her tracks when someone, well, didn't exactly try to sneak up on them. Oi! A familiar voice called out, instantly causing the feline to freeze as her rear stood straight up. Don't leave me hanging here!